Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The winter of 1915 was particularly harsh in Pike County, Kentucky. The coal mines worked overtime despite the biting cold, and the McCoy homestead stood silently against the backdrop of bare trees on the outskirts of Pikeville. The property had been in the family for 3 generations, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains where the land drops and rises in unexpected ways. The old well, approximately 50 yards behind the main house, had been sealed off that December, an ordinary occurrence that wouldn't have warranted any attention if not for what followed. Sheriff Thomas Hatfield's report, dated January 3, 1916, noted that Elijah McCoy, the 57-year-old patriarch of the family, had not been seen in town for nearly 2 weeks. Neighbors reported that smoke continued to rise from the chimney, suggesting occupancy, yet no one had laid eyes on Elijah since before Christmas. His wagon had remained in the same position, partially covered by accumulating snow. What drew attention was not his absence, but rather the unusual activity observed at night, lantern light, moving between the house and the direction of the old well after midnight on at least 3 separate occasions. The McCoy property had a troubled history within the community. Following the notorious Hatfield-McCoy feud that had largely subsided by the turn of the century, this particular branch of McCoys had withdrawn from public life. Elijah's wife, Sarah, had passed away in 1908, according to church records, though, peculiarly, no funeral service was held. Their only son, William, had reportedly moved west in 1910, though no correspondence was ever received. Elijah lived alone, keeping mostly to himself, occasionally selling firewood in town, but rarely engaging in conversation. The feud that had once defined relations between the Hatfields and McCoys had grown from disputed ownership of a few pigs in the 1870s into a bloody conflict that claimed more than a dozen lives. Though the violence had largely ended by 1900, tensions remained beneath the surface of daily interactions. This lingering animosity made the isolation of Elijah's branch of the family seem almost natural to locals, a continuation of old patterns rather than something worthy of concern. When Deputy James Collins first approached the property on January 4, 1916, he documented that the house appeared undisturbed. The front door was unlocked, not unusual for rural Kentucky homes of the era. Inside, he found a cold hearth, suggesting no fire had been lit for at least a day. A half-eaten meal sat at the kitchen table, a thin layer of frost covering what appeared to be beans and cornbread. The bed was unmade, and Elijah's heavy winter coat still hung by the door. Deputy Collins noted in his report the unsettling stillness of the house, as if time itself had stopped. The family Bible lay open on a small table near the fireplace, turned to the book of Ezekiel. A passage about voices from the deep had been underlined in pencil, the mark appearing recent. Collins, a religious man himself, found this detail disturbing enough to include in his official documentation, though he offered no interpretation of its significance. What troubled the deputy most, according to his written statement, was the discovery of 3 sets of footprints in the snow leading from the back door to the recently sealed well. One set appeared to drag heavily, while the other 2 walked alongside. All 3 led to the well, but only 2 sets returned to the house. The footprints were partially filled with fresh snow, indicating they had been made at least a day prior to the deputy's arrival. Upon closer examination, Collins observed that one set of returning footprints showed a distinctly different stride pattern than when heading toward the well. Shorter steps, a slight drag to the left foot that hadn't been present before. As if, he noted reluctantly in his report, someone wearing the same boots was not the same person returning. This observation would later be stricken from official records at Sheriff Hatfield's instruction, deemed speculative and unhelpful. The McCoy well had been dug in 1867, according to county records. It had served the property faithfully until 1912, when Elijah had a new well constructed closer to the house, supposedly for convenience as he aged. The old well had remained open, but unused for years, until that December when it was suddenly sealed with a heavy wooden cover topped with a large flat stone that would have required considerable strength to move. Local stonemason Harold Jenkins had noted in his business ledger that Elijah had specifically requested a stone heavy enough that it would take 2 men to move it. Jenkins had found the request unusual, but not concerning enough to mention it to anyone until questioned by authorities. Jenkins added a detail not included in his official statement. Elijah had insisted the work be completed before the winter solstice, offering extra payment for urgency. When Jenkins inquired about the reason for haste, Elijah reportedly replied, "Some things need to be settled before the longest night." Jenkins dismissed this as the superstition common among older mountain residents, many of whom still held to folklore regarding significant dates and natural cycles. Margaret Wilson, who lived on the neighboring property approximately half a mile down the road, provided a written testimony that would later be sealed by court order. In it, she described hearing a sound unlike anything natural coming from the direction of the McCoy property on the night of December 23rd. She described it as not quite human, yet not animal either, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself before being suddenly silenced. When questioned further, she refused to elaborate, only adding that she had kept her doors locked and windows shuttered every night since. Wilson's teenage son, Jacob, proved more forthcoming when interviewed separately. He told Deputy Collins that he had been returning from late-night hunting when he saw lantern light near the old well. From his vantage point on a ridge overlooking the property, he observed 2 figures. One he recognized as Elijah, the other unfamiliar. They appeared to be engaged in heated conversation, though he was too distant to hear words. The second figure gestured repeatedly toward the well, while Elijah shook his head. Eventually, both men returned to the house. Jacob had thought little of it until his mother mentioned the strange sounds days later. Reverend Samuel Thompson of the Pikeville Baptist Church added another layer to the growing mystery. In his statement to Sheriff Hatfield, he mentioned that Elijah had visited him on December 18th, appearing unusually agitated. According to the Reverend, Elijah had inquired about biblical accounts of voices from below the earth and whether there were means to silence what should not speak. The Reverend had attempted to schedule a proper visit to the McCoy property, but was politely yet firmly turned away by Elijah, who claimed he would handle the matter himself. Thompson's church records, examined during the investigation, revealed another curious detail. Sarah McCoy's death in 1908 had been recorded, but the cause was listed simply as passed into God's hands, unusual for a time when specific ailments were typically documented. More striking was a note in the margin beside this entry, written in Thompson's hand. No viewing. E. Insistent on immediate burial. Unusual circumstances, but respected family wishes given their history. The initial investigation proceeded cautiously. When authorities removed the stone and wooden cover from the old well on January 5th, they found it had been filled nearly to the top with soil and rock. This was unusual. A well typically would be simply covered if no longer in use, not filled. The labor required to fill a well of that depth would have been substantial. Dr. Howard Reynolds, who was present during the initial examination, noted in his report that the soil appeared to come from various locations on the property. Some showed the rich darkness of riverbed soil, while other layers contained the red clay typical of the higher elevations behind the property. Reynolds also observed what appeared to be cloth fragments mixed with the upper layers of soil. When extracted and examined, these were determined to be from a shirt of the type Elijah was known to wear. This discovery prompted Sheriff Hatfield to officially classify the case as a potential homicide investigation, though he remained careful to avoid stoking community fears by keeping this designation confidential. A decision was made to excavate the well. The process began on January 7, 1916, with 4 men working in rotation. Progress was slow due to the confined space and the densely packed material. On the second day of excavation, at approximately 12 feet down, they discovered the first object, a pocket watch belonging to Elijah McCoy, identified by an engraving on the inside cover. The discovery shifted the investigation immediately. The watch's condition suggested it hadn't been in the well long, the mechanism still functioned when wound, and minimal corrosion was visible on the metal case. Most tellingly, the watch had stopped at 11:42, and the date wheel showed December 24th. One detail about the watch, mentioned only in Dr. Reynolds' personal notes, was the presence of what appeared to be deliberately scratched markings on the inside of the case. Symbols that Reynolds described as reminiscent of certain folk charms I have observed used by the older mountain families for protection. He sketched these markings but offered no interpretation of their potential meaning or relevance to the case. By the third day, at approximately 20 feet depth, they uncovered a leather-bound ledger. The pages contained meticulous records of the McCoy family dating back to 1875. Most entries were mundane: births, marriages, financial transactions. However, several pages appeared to have been torn out, specifically those covering the period between 1907 and 1909, the time surrounding Sarah McCoy's reported death. The remaining pages showed increasingly erratic handwriting, with entries becoming more cryptic. The final legible entry, dated December 20th, 1915, read, "It has begun speaking to him now, too. I hear them at night, his footsteps mirroring mine from years before. Soon there will be resolution." The ledger contained several recurring phrases that investigators initially dismissed as the ramblings of an isolated mind. References to the keeper, the voices below, and the cycle of 7 appeared with increasing frequency in later entries. Of particular note was a pattern that emerged when dates were examined. Major life events and deaths connected to the McCoy property seemed to occur in 7-year intervals, beginning with the original well's construction in 1867. Local historian Edward Blackburn, who was permitted to examine the ledger briefly before it was taken as evidence, noted something unusual about the handwriting. While maintaining similar characteristics throughout, suggesting a single author, the writing showed subtle shifts in style approximately every 7 years. Blackburn suggested this might indicate periods of significant stress or change in the writer's circumstances, though he admitted this was merely speculation. What Blackburn did not share with investigators, but later confided to his daughter, as revealed in her 1962 memoir of her father's work, was his belief that the ledger had been maintained by at least 2 different people, both attempting to mimic the same handwriting style but with subtle differences that became apparent to a trained eye. This observation would gain significance as the investigation progressed. The excavation continued with increased urgency. At 27 feet, they found the first of what would eventually be documented as 17 glass jars, each sealed with wax. Inside each jar was a folded piece of paper with a single name written on it. 15 of these names were unknown to investigators or local residents. 2, however, corresponded to individuals who had been reported missing in Pike County between 1908 and 1915. A traveling salesman named Thomas Gardner, who disappeared in 1910, and a local midwife, Eleanor Blackwood, who vanished in 1913. Curiously, each jar also contained a small personal effect, a button, a lock of hair, a coin, or similar small item. These items showed no apparent pattern or significance to investigators at the time. The jars themselves were standard canning jars, available at any general store in the region, offering no unique identifying features that might have helped the investigation. Dr. Reynolds, in examining these personal effects, noted that several of the hair samples appeared to have been cut post-mortem based on their condition and the irregular cutting pattern. This observation was excluded from official reports at Sheriff Hatfield's instruction, who feared it would cause undue panic in the community. Sheriff Hatfield's personal journal, made available to researchers in 1962 following his death, revealed his growing unease with the investigation. He wrote of strange occurrences at the excavation site, tools that would go missing only to reappear in different locations, unexplained cold spots even on relatively mild days, and most disturbing, the tendency of workers to become disoriented when descending too far into the well. Several reported hearing whispering that seemed to come from below, despite being the only person in the shaft at the time. Hatfield documented his own experience on the night of January 9th, when he remained at the site after workers had departed. Stood by the excavation after sunset. The air grows unusually still around this place after dark. No night creatures, no wind in the trees. At approximately 8:30, heard what sounded like my name called from the direction of the shaft. A trick of the mind, surely, yet I found myself responding almost involuntarily. The voice, if such it was, spoke again, this time with words I could not make out, but that left me with a profound sense of unease. I departed immediately thereafter. One of the workers, Samuel Davis, abruptly quit on January 10th without collecting his final wages. When tracked down by Deputy Collins, Davis refused to explain his reasons, saying only, "Some things ain't meant to be disturbed. What's down there knows things it shouldn't." He left Pikeville the following day, reportedly relocating to Louisville. Subsequent attempts to contact him for further information proved unsuccessful. On January 11, 1916, at approximately 35 feet depth, the excavation was abruptly halted when workers uncovered human remains. Initial examination by Dr. Howard Reynolds, the county physician, determined them to be those of an adult male, likely deceased for less than a month. While official records listed these remains as presumably Elijah McCoy, the doctor's private notes, only discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1954, expressed doubt about this conclusion. According to those notes, the condition of the remains suggested the individual had been confined in a small space for an extended period before death. Furthermore, certain anatomical details did not align with a man of Elijah's age and known medical history. Most troubling was Dr. Reynolds' observation that the position of the remains suggested the individual had still been alive when the well began to be filled. The soil compacted around the body showed evidence of movement after burial, with spaces where the individual had apparently tried to create room to breathe. Dr. Reynolds also documented unusual markings on the bones, patterns that appeared deliberately carved rather than resulting from injury or natural causes. He sketched several of these markings in his notes, but offered no interpretation of their meaning. When compared to historical records decades later, some researchers noted similarities to certain Appalachian folk symbols used for protection against evil, though this connection remains speculative. The discovery of human remains transformed what had been a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Sheriff Hatfield ordered the property sealed and placed under guard. News of the discovery spread quickly through Pikeville and surrounding communities, reviving discussions of the old feud and its potential connection to current events. Hatfield found himself managing not just an investigation, but also community fears that threatened to reignite old tensions. The investigation took an unexpected turn when, on January 13th, a man identifying himself as William McCoy, Elijah's son, arrived in Pikeville. His appearance contradicted local understanding that William had moved west years earlier. He presented documentation proving his identity and claimed to have been corresponding with his father regularly. He produced several letters purportedly from Elijah, dated as recently as December 18, 1915. William was described in official reports as a well-spoken man in his early 30s, dressed in quality clothing suggesting financial comfort. He carried himself with confidence and education that seemed at odds with the isolated upbringing he would have had on the McCoy property. When questioned about this discrepancy, he explained that he had made a successful living in Colorado's mining industry and had educated himself through extensive reading and association with business partners. Local banker Franklin Morris, who had known Elijah for decades, was asked to confirm William's identity. Morris stated that while there was certainly a family resemblance, he had last seen William as a teenager and could not be absolutely certain. He did, however, confirm that the signature on William's documentation matched samples of William's adolescent handwriting kept in bank records from when a small trust had been established for him years earlier. William's account created confusion among investigators. He claimed his father had written about selling the property and joining him in Colorado, where William had established himself. He expressed shock at his father's disappearance and offered a substantial reward for information. His presence and cooperation initially seemed to simplify the investigation, a case of foul play against Elijah by unknown parties. However, inconsistencies in William's statements began to emerge. When shown his father's ledger, he appeared visibly disturbed by certain entries, but refused to explain why. He could not account for why he had received no formal education despite the family's relatively stable financial situation. Most tellingly, he identified a photograph as his mother Sarah, when local records indicated it was actually Eleanor Blackwood, the missing midwife. When questioned about the sealed well, William claimed ignorance of his father's reasons for filling it. He suggested it might have been a safety measure, given Elijah's advancing age and solitary lifestyle. When informed of the human remains discovered in the well, he appeared genuinely shocked, though Sheriff Hatfield noted in his private journal that William's reaction seemed studied, as if he had prepared himself for this revelation but wished to appear surprised. Town Clerk Josephine Murray noted in her personal diary, discovered among her effects after her death in 1937, that William seemed unfamiliar with local landmarks and family connections that any true McCoy would have known. She wrote, "He asked directions to the Tug Fork Bridge, which has been the main crossing to the McCoy property for nearly 40 years. No son of Elijah would need such guidance." Her suspicions were not officially recorded, as she felt them too vague to bring to the sheriff's attention. Murray also documented an unusual encounter with William at the town records office. He had requested access to property deeds and birth records, claiming to be sorting out his father's affairs. While reviewing these materials, he asked several questions about Eleanor Blackwood, showing particular interest in her family connections and history in the area. When Murray mentioned that Blackwood had disappeared in 1913, William quickly changed the subject. The investigation stalled as winter deepened. William McCoy took up residence in his father's house, despite the ongoing investigation. Local witnesses reported unusual activity. William frequently visited the filled-in well at night, sometimes standing beside it for hours regardless of the weather. He began making inquiries about other wells and deep shafts in the area, claiming an interest in local water resources. Samuel Davis, a coal miner who occasionally hunted in the woods behind the McCoy property, reported observing William engaged in what appeared to be one-sided conversations at the well site. Davis, maintaining a discreet distance, could not make out words, but described William's behavior as that of a man arguing with someone he couldn't see, gesturing emphatically and occasionally falling silent, as if listening to a response. Davis did not immediately report these observations, fearing they would be dismissed as fantastical. During this period, William maintained regular contact with Sheriff Hatfield, inquiring about investigation progress and offering suggestions that often seemed designed to direct attention away from the property itself. He proposed theories involving transient workers from the coal mines or lingering resentments from the old feud. Hatfield noted that while these theories were plausible on the surface, they consistently steered the investigation toward external threats, rather than anything connected directly to Elijah or the McCoy property. In February 1916, a previously unknown cellar was discovered beneath the McCoy barn. Access was through a trapdoor hidden under hay bales and farming equipment. Inside, investigators found evidence that someone had been living there for an extended period, perhaps years. The space contained a small cot, preserved food, books, and a writing desk with paper matching the notes found in the glass jars from the well. The discovery occurred when Deputy Collins, acting on growing suspicions about William's activities, conducted a more thorough search of the outbuildings than had been performed initially. William had been notably absent during this particular visit, having traveled to Pikeville on business, the first time he had left the property since his arrival. The cellar walls were covered with writing, dates, names, and cryptic phrases that often referenced the voice or the keeper. One recurring phrase, "The well does not give back what it claims," appeared in several locations, becoming increasingly distorted and frantic in its appearance. A thorough examination revealed that the writing had been done in multiple substances, ink, charcoal, and in some cases, what Dr. Reynolds reluctantly identified as human blood. Most disturbing was the discovery of a journal written in a cramped, erratic hand. The entries detailed observations of the main house and its occupants from 1908 onward. While the writer never identified themselves, the content suggested intimate knowledge of the McCoy family. The final entry, dated December 20th, 1915, read only, "He has discovered me. Tonight it ends." The journal contained detailed accounts of conversations allegedly overheard between Elijah and an entity the writer referred to only as it. According to these entries, Elijah spent hours at the old well, sometimes lowering items on a rope, food, small animals, and occasionally items belonging to people who had gone missing. The writer described a pattern. After each offering, Elijah would receive instruction about individuals who needed to be returned to the earth. One particularly chilling entry from 1913 described the arrival of Eleanor Blackwood at the property. She had come to check on Elijah after he missed several church services, a courtesy call that allegedly resulted in her becoming aware of the truth beneath. The writer claimed to have watched from hiding as Elijah led her to the well, where she apparently heard the same voices that spoke to him. Unlike Elijah, her reaction was one of horror and attempted flight. The entry ended abruptly. E returned alone, another offering made. The cycle continues. Dr. Reynolds, upon examining the cellar, noted that the confined space and lack of natural light would have had severe psychological effects on anyone living there for an extended period. The presence of multiple oil lamps suggested an attempt to combat the darkness, though ventilation would have been poor when the trapdoor was sealed from above. Most significant was Reynolds' observation that the handwriting on the walls matched neither Elijah's hand, as seen in the ledger, nor any samples of William's writing that had been obtained. This raised the possibility of a third individual being involved, someone who had been present on the property but unknown to the community. William McCoy denied any knowledge of the cellar or its contents. His behavior became increasingly erratic as the investigation continued. Several local merchants reported that he had purchased unusual quantities of preserving jars, wax, and rope. When questioned about these purchases, William claimed he was preparing preserves using his father's old recipes and needed the rope for general farm maintenance. The explanation was accepted, though noted as peculiar given the winter season. Deputy Collins, growing increasingly suspicious, took the initiative to interview Jacob Wilson again. The teenager revealed that he had continued to observe the property from a distance and had seen William engaging in behavior similar to what he had previously witnessed from Elijah, spending long periods at the well site, sometimes appearing to speak to it. Most concerning was Jacob's claim that on the night of February 18th he had observed William leaving the property with a large bundle over his shoulder, heading into the wooded area behind the property. William had returned alone approximately 2 hours later. Collins, acting without Sheriff Hatfield's knowledge, organized a small search party to examine the wooded area Jacob had indicated. They found nothing unusual, though Collins noted in his unofficial report that the ground had been disturbed in several locations, as if someone had been digging, though whether recently or not was impossible to determine due to recurring snow and freezing conditions. On February 23, 1916, William abruptly announced his intention to return to Colorado, stating that his father had clearly met with foul play and that remaining in Kentucky was too painful. Before authorities could question him further, he departed, leaving behind all of Elijah's possessions. Sheriff Hatfield, increasingly troubled by inconsistencies in the case, dispatched telegrams to Colorado attempting to verify William's residence and business dealings there. The responses, which arrived in early March, indicated that no William McCoy was known in the mining communities where he claimed to have established himself. Furthermore, the address given for his Colorado residence was identified as an abandoned property that had stood empty for at least 5 years. This revelation prompted Hatfield to issue a warrant for the man identifying himself as William McCoy, now suspected of fraudulent identity and potential involvement in Elijah's disappearance. Despite distribution of his description to law enforcement across several states, no confirmed sightings were ever reported. He had effectively vanished. The case might have remained unresolved, filed away as another mysterious disappearance, if not for the spring thaw of 1916. In April, heavy rains caused significant flooding in parts of Pike County. The ground around the old McCoy well began to sink, suggesting the fill material was settling. County authorities decided to complete the excavation that had been abandoned in January. The decision to resume excavation was not unanimous. Deputy Collins, in particular, argued against it, citing the strange occurrences that had plagued the first attempt. His concerns were overruled by Sheriff Hatfield, who felt professional obligation to complete the investigation despite his own misgivings, which he confided only to his personal journal. At approximately 45 feet depth, they discovered a second set of human remains. These were determined to be much older, likely interred between 7 and 8 years earlier. Dr. Reynolds concluded these remains belonged to a female, roughly corresponding to Sarah McCoy's age and physical description. However, certain aspects of the remains contradicted official records, specifically evidence of a severe physical disability that had never been attributed to Sarah during her life. Examination of the female remains revealed healed fractures consistent with long-term confinement and possible physical abuse. The positioning suggested she had been placed in the well with care, unlike the more recent remains found above. Most notably, a wedding ring was found still on the left hand, with an inscription matching the date of Elijah and Sarah McCoy's marriage in 1882. Dr. Reynolds performed a thorough examination of these remains, comparing them to medical records available for Sarah McCoy. His findings, documented in a report that was subsequently sealed by court order, indicated significant inconsistencies. The woman in the well showed evidence of a congenital spinal condition that would have been immediately apparent to anyone who saw her. Yet, no community records or recollections of Sarah mentioned any such disability. Additionally, dental work visible in the remains did not match the limited dental records available for Sarah. As the excavation continued, workers reported increasing difficulty. Equipment malfunctioned with unusual frequency, and several men complained of dizziness and disorientation when working at the greater depths. One worker, Joseph Miller, had to be pulled from the well after becoming unresponsive. Upon recovery, he claimed to have heard a woman crying, begging to be let out, despite being alone in the shaft at the time. He refused to return to work and left Pikeville entirely the following day. The final stages of excavation were completed with workers rotating frequently, spending no more than 20 minutes at a time in the shaft. Sheriff Hatfield maintained a constant presence, documenting every item recovered and ensuring chain of custody for all evidence. His journal entries from this period reveal growing personal strain, difficulty sleeping, constant tension, and the persistent feeling of being watched whenever near the property. The most significant discovery came at the bottom of the well, approximately 60 feet down. A small metal box, sealed with multiple locks, contained documents that would reshape the entire understanding of the case. Inside were birth certificates, property deeds, and personal letters revealing that the man known locally as Elijah McCoy had assumed that identity in 1898. His real name was William Hatfield, a distant relation to the family that had feuded with the McCoys for decades. According to these documents, the real Elijah McCoy and his wife Sarah had disappeared during a supposed trip to Cincinnati in 1898. William Hatfield had systematically assumed Elijah's identity, using his knowledge of local families and isolation to avoid detection. The documents suggested he had kept the real Sarah McCoy alive in the cellar for nearly 10 years before her death or murder in 1908. The papers included detailed notes on how Hatfield had maintained his deception, observing Elijah's mannerisms and speech patterns before taking his place, studying his handwriting, and gradually distancing himself from community involvement to minimize chances of discovery. He had even gone so far as to inflict a matching scar on his left forearm to replicate an injury the real Elijah had sustained in a farming accident in 1895. Most disturbing was a series of letters between Hatfield and an unidentified correspondent discussing the potential beneath the McCoy land and references to something discovered during the digging of the original well in 1867. The correspondent, identified only as T, provided instructions for maintaining the balance and feeding what lies below. The final letter, dated 1897, indicated that T would be arriving to assess progress, suggesting direct involvement in planning the identity theft that would occur the following year. The most disturbing evidence came in the form of a detailed confession, apparently written by Hatfield himself. In it, he described living a double life for years, Elijah McCoy to the outside world, William Hatfield in the confines of the property. He wrote of the voices from the well that had guided his actions, convincing him that by containing certain individuals, he was maintaining balance in the world. The confession included passages describing how Hatfield first discovered the well's unusual properties. In 1898, shortly after taking over the McCoy identity, he claimed to have heard whispers emanating from the well during a severe drought. Initial skepticism gave way to belief when the voices accurately predicted a coming storm that ended the drought. Over time, the voices allegedly became more demanding, requesting tributes in exchange for continued guidance. Hatfield described a gradual process of escalation, beginning with small offerings of food and personal possessions, then progressing to livestock, and eventually human tributes. The first human offering was purportedly an accident, a traveling peddler who had threatened to expose inconsistencies in Hatfield's assumed identity. According to the confession, after this individual was returned to the earth, the voices became clearer and more insistent, demanding regular nourishment. The confession identified the young man who had appeared in January as Robert Gardner, the son of Thomas Gardner, the traveling salesman who had disappeared in 1910. According to the document, Robert had discovered his father's fate and confronted Hatfield in December 1915. What followed was described as a reversal. Robert forced Hatfield into the cellar, assuming control of the property and the identity of William McCoy. Hatfield's confession included a disturbing pattern. Approximately every 7 years, the well would demand a significant offering. The first had been Sarah McCoy in 1908, followed by others at regular intervals. Between these major events, smaller tributes were required: animals, personal possessions, and occasionally travelers who wouldn't be missed. Each tribute corresponded with information or assistance that benefited Hatfield in maintaining his deception and isolated existence. The most chilling aspect of the confession was its final paragraph. He thinks he has ended it by returning me to the earth, but he doesn't understand. The well doesn't want endings, it wants continuations. Even now I hear him pacing above, his footsteps matching mine from years before. He speaks to the well as I once did. Soon he will bring it another offering, continuing what cannot be stopped. The names are already written, the jars prepared. The well has simply found a new keeper. Sheriff Hatfield, upon reviewing these documents, ordered them sealed immediately. His journal reveals his struggle to reconcile the evidence with rational explanation. What am I to make of this? A man who stole another's identity claims to have been guided by voices from a well. Mental illness seems the obvious conclusion, yet how to explain the accuracy of details that have been independently verified? And if there is truth to the identity of the young man as Robert Gardner, where has he gone? The circular nature of these events disturbs me deeply. By the time authorities returned to the McCoy property with this new information, the house stood empty. Robert Gardner, alias William McCoy, had disappeared. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded no results. Items missing from the house suggested hasty departure rather than planned travel. Food from the pantry, a single change of clothes, and a hunting rifle were gone, but other valuables remained undisturbed. During the investigation of the property following Gardner's disappearance, several additional discoveries were made. A hidden compartment beneath the kitchen floorboards contained 17 empty glass jars identical to those found in the well, along with a list of names, some crossed out, others untouched. The untouched names corresponded to residents of Pikeville and surrounding communities, all still living at the time of discovery. Most concerning was finding Sheriff Hatfield's name among those not yet crossed out, along with Deputy Collins and several others involved in the investigation. This discovery was kept strictly confidential, with Hatfield informing only those directly affected and implementing discreet protective measures for their families. The property was eventually sold at auction in 1917, but remained uninhabited. 3 separate families purchased it over the following 5 years, but none stayed longer than a few months. Complaints ranged from unusual noises at night to a pervasive sense of being watched. The final owners, the Tanner family, abandoned the property after their youngest son claimed to have seen a man with no face standing by the sealed well, beckoning him to approach. Elizabeth Tanner, the family matriarch, provided a more detailed account in a letter to her sister, discovered decades later in family papers. She described progressive disturbances, first objects moving when no one was present, then whispering sounds emanating from the walls at night. Most troubling were the recurring dreams experienced by all family members, dreams of descending into darkness while unseen voices called their names. The breaking point came when Mr. Tanner discovered their son sleepwalking toward the well site in the middle of the night, mumbling about going below where I'm needed. A fire of unknown origin destroyed the main house in 1922. Investigators found no evidence of arson, yet the blaze had started simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the structure. The barn remained standing, but was eventually torn down in 1925, when the county reclaimed the land for unpaid taxes. The cellar beneath it was filled with concrete on the recommendation of Sheriff Hatfield, who had never felt comfortable with the case's resolution. Hatfield, in a letter to the county commissioners requesting the cellar be sealed, wrote only, "For public safety and peace of mind, I strongly advise that this structure be permanently closed in a manner that prevents future access. My reasons are detailed in the sealed records of the 1916 investigation, which should remain confidential." His request was granted without question, a testament to the respect he had earned during his tenure as sheriff. The land has remained undeveloped to this day. Early attempts to incorporate it into neighboring farms were abandoned when crops planted there consistently failed. Livestock refused to graze in the vicinity of the former well site. By 1930, local consensus held that the land was soured, and it was left to return to forest. In 1937, a hunter named Michael Sullivan disappeared in the vicinity of the former McCoy property. A search party followed his trail to within 100 yards of the old well site before losing it completely. Sullivan was never found. His hunting partner reported that Sullivan had mentioned hearing someone calling his name from the direction of the property shortly before his disappearance. The incident was investigated but ultimately classified as an accidental death, presumably from falling into one of the many abandoned mine shafts in the region. What the official report omitted but was recorded in Sheriff Hatfield's successor's private notes were the unusual aspects of the disappearance. Sullivan's footprints in the soft ground followed a straight line toward the old well site, despite obstacles that would normally have caused deviation. More troublingly, they showed a progressively altered gait, beginning as normal strides but becoming increasingly erratic, as if the man had been stumbling or being dragged, though no second set of prints was visible. The search was officially abandoned after 4 days, but Sullivan's brother Joseph continued looking for another week. He eventually reported finding a sealed jar half buried near where the trail had been lost. Inside was a piece of paper bearing Michael's name. When he returned the next day with witnesses, the jar could not be located. Joseph became increasingly obsessed with the McCoy property, camping near it for several weeks until local authorities insisted he leave. He reportedly moved away from Pike County shortly thereafter, his reputation damaged by what many considered to be grief-induced delusions. Throughout the 1940s, the area around the former McCoy property became increasingly avoided by local residents. Parents warned children to stay away. Hunters circumvented it despite game being plentiful in the surrounding woods, and even timber companies excluded it from harvesting plans despite the mature hardwoods that had established themselves. No official restrictions existed. The avoidance was cultural, passed down through families with only vague references to bad things having happened there. In 1954, during research for a book on Appalachian family histories, Professor Martin Lawson from the University of Kentucky discovered additional documentation related to the case. County records revealed that between 1898 and 1915, 23 people had been reported missing within a 30-mile radius of the McCoy property. Of the 17 names found in the glass jars, 15 were eventually matched to these missing persons. Lawson's investigation extended beyond official records. He conducted interviews with elderly residents who recalled the events of 1916, including Margaret Wilson's daughter, who shared her mother's private accounts of the case. According to these conversations, Margaret had heard not just undefined sounds from the McCoy property, but distinct words, "I'm still here," and "it's never enough," repeated in different voices on multiple occasions. One of Lawson's most significant discoveries came through correspondence with Thomas Gardner's family in Ohio. They provided him with letters from Robert Gardner, dating from 1909 to 1910, describing his father's regular sales route through eastern Kentucky and his intention to investigate a promising lead in Pike County regarding potential coal rights for sale. The final letter mentioned meeting with a Mr. McCoy who had property that might be available. After this, no further communication was received, leading eventually to Robert's journey to find his father. Of particular interest to Lawson was the pattern of disappearances. He plotted them on a map and discovered they formed a rough spiral centered on the McCoy property, with the distance between the property and disappearance locations gradually increasing over time. Additionally, he noted that the frequency of disappearances corresponded to lunar cycles, with most occurring during the dark of the moon. Lawson's academic colleagues largely dismissed these patterns as coincidental or the result of selective data interpretation. His department chair advised him to focus on more conventional historical research, suggesting that his current direction risked his academic reputation. Undeterred, Lawson requested access to the sealed court records from the original investigation, citing their historical significance. His request received unexpected support from Judge William Hatfield, son of the former sheriff, who had inherited his father's private papers. The judge provided Lawson with limited access to these materials while maintaining the confidentiality of the official sealed records. Among Sheriff Hatfield's papers was a detailed map of the McCoy property with annotations suggesting the well connected to a natural cave system beneath, a possibility never officially acknowledged in the investigation. Lawson's research was never published. His notes indicate he traveled to the site of the former McCoy property in November 1954. His final journal entry described plans to conduct an overnight observation of the well site during the new moon. He never returned to the university. His abandoned vehicle was discovered near the property, but despite an extensive search, no trace of Lawson himself was ever found. The search for Lawson involved more resources than had been allocated for previous disappearances in the area. State police joined local authorities, and university officials pressured for thorough investigation. Despite 5 days of intensive searching with dogs and experienced trackers, no trail was established beyond the vicinity of Lawson's vehicle. The only potential evidence discovered on the second day was a broken pocket watch stopped at 11:42, the same time shown on Elijah McCoy's watch found in the well decades earlier. The coincidence was noted in the official report, but dismissed as likely unrelated. University authorities, concerned by the increasingly paranoid tone of Lawson's later notes, attributed his disappearance to mental breakdown. His research was archived without review, considered the product of academic pressure and isolation rather than legitimate historical inquiry. It would remain untouched until 1967, when a graduate student named Catherine Miller stumbled upon it while researching Appalachian folklore. Miller, finding Lawson's research methodical and well-documented despite its unusual conclusions, began her own investigation into both the original McCoy case and Lawson's disappearance. Her inquiries revealed that Lawson had been in contact with a local guide named Samuel Blackwood, great-nephew of Eleanor Blackwood, the midwife who had disappeared in 1913. According to university correspondence, Blackwood had agreed to accompany Lawson to the McCoy property on the night of his disappearance, but later claimed Lawson had never arrived at their meeting point. Further investigation revealed that Blackwood himself had vanished from Pike County less than a week after Lawson's disappearance. His home was found abandoned, with personal effects still in place, suggesting hasty departure. Most notably, his family Bible was left open to the Book of Ezekiel, the same book found open in Elijah McCoy's house in 1916. No trace of Blackwood was ever found, and the coincidence was never officially acknowledged in connection with Lawson's case. Miller's subsequent investigation was cut short when the university denied her request to visit the former McCoy property. Official correspondence cited safety concerns regarding unstable ground and abandoned mine shafts. Unofficially, according to Miller's personal journal, her advisor warned her that certain university trustees with connections to Pike County had expressed significant discomfort with renewed interest in the case. Despite these obstacles, Miller continued her research through correspondence with local historical societies and elderly residents of the area. She compiled a significant body of folklore surrounding the McCoy property, noting the consistency of certain elements despite the storytellers having no apparent connection to each other. Recurring themes included voices from below, individuals being called to the property, and the significance of 7-year cycles. In 1967, during construction of a new county road that would pass near the former McCoy property, workers discovered an old leather satchel buried approximately 3 feet underground. Inside were personal effects belonging to Professor Lawson, along with a sealed mason jar containing a single piece of paper. The paper bore a list of names, the last of which was Martin Lawson, with the date November 17, 1954. Above his name were 2 others, Robert Gardner and William Hatfield, Elijah McCoy. All 3 names had been crossed out. The satchel also contained a journal that appeared to belong to Lawson, though the handwriting in later entries showed subtle differences from his known hand. The final entry, dated November 17, 1954, read, "I understand now. The well doesn't speak. It echoes. What we hear is ourselves, reflected back from the darkness below. What calls to us is our own voice. distorted by depth and time. I go to silence it, though I suspect this merely continues what began long ago. If you find this, do not follow. The cycle must end. The remaining names, 13 in total, were unfamiliar to investigators. The case file was officially closed in 1968, with no conclusive findings beyond those established in 1916. The satchel and its contents were placed in storage at the county courthouse, where a clerk noted an unusual detail. The handwriting for all entries on the list appeared identical, despite spanning names presumably written decades apart. More disturbing was the clerk's observation that the most recent entry included not just a name, but a date, June 12, 1968, 2 weeks in the future from the time of discovery. When June 12th arrived, a county road worker named Thomas Jenkins disappeared while conducting routine maintenance near the old McCoy property. His name matched the final entry on the list. The coincidence was noted, but dismissed as either chance or possible tampering with the evidence after its discovery. Following Jenkins's disappearance, the planned road construction was rerouted to bypass the former McCoy property by a significant margin. Official documentation cited unstable ground conditions as the reason for the change, though local rumors suggested workers had refused to continue the original route after Jenkins vanished. The additional cost was absorbed without protest, an unusual occurrence that did not go unnoticed by local journalists but generated no official response to inquiries. The former McCoy property has remained undeveloped despite the expansion of Pikeville and surrounding communities. Local residents avoid the area, particularly the depression in the ground where the well once stood. In dry summers, the outline of the well becomes visible as vegetation refuses to grow in a perfect circle, approximately 6 feet in diameter. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the site occasionally attracted curiosity seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. Several reported unusual experiences, unexplained cold spots, the sensation of being watched, and in 2 documented cases, hearing what sounded like whispers emanating from the ground. Local authorities generally discouraged such visits, citing safety concerns rather than acknowledging the site's disturbing history. James Hatfield, grandson of Sheriff Thomas Hatfield, served as county sheriff from 1975 to 1988. During his tenure, he maintained a policy of discreet surveillance of the McCoy property, assigning deputies to drive by the access road regularly and note any unusual activity. When questioned about this practice by county commissioners concerned about resource allocation, he cited only historical significance and prevention of vandalism as justification. The practice ended with his retirement, but his private papers, released after his death in 2002, revealed his true motivation, continuing his grandfather's vigil against what the original sheriff had described as something that must be watched, but never disturbed. In 1962, a geological survey of the area noted an unusual feature beneath the former McCoy property. Using equipment that was advanced for the time, surveyors detected what appeared to be a natural cavity or chamber in the bedrock, directly beneath where the well had been located. The chamber was estimated to be significantly larger than the well itself, suggesting the well may have inadvertently connected to a natural formation. The survey report was filed and forgotten until 1968, when it was briefly referenced during the final closure of the investigation. The survey team leader, Dr. Alan Foster, included a personal note in his official report that was subsequently removed from public records but preserved in his private papers. In it, he described unusual equipment malfunctions when attempting to determine the full extent of the subterranean chamber. More troubling was his account of team members reporting auditory hallucinations, specifically the sound of their names being called from the direction of the depression marking the former well site. Dr. Foster recommended no further investigation without significant safety precautions, though he did not specify what dangers he anticipated. In his private correspondence with colleagues at other institutions, Foster expressed more explicit concerns. Something about this formation defies conventional geological explanation. The chamber appears to shift between measurements, as if its dimensions are not fixed. More troubling is its apparent isolation. We can detect no natural passages connecting it to known cave systems in the region. It exists as if in isolation, yet our equipment indicates movement within. I cannot explain this in terms that would satisfy scientific scrutiny, which is why I've omitted these observations from my official report. In 1981, a graduate student in geology named David Chen attempted to conduct a more thorough survey of the subterranean features. Using more advanced equipment than had been available in 1962, he detected not just a chamber, but what appeared to be a network of narrow tunnels extending outward from it. His request for funding to conduct exploratory drilling was denied, with his faculty advisor citing concerns about disturbing potential archaeological sites. Chen's subsequent appeals were rejected, and he eventually abandoned the project. What Chen did not include in his official research proposal, but confided to his roommate in recorded conversations discovered after his suicide in 1983, was his belief that the tunnels showed evidence of artificial construction, tool marks, and deliberate structural reinforcement that would be inconsistent with natural formation. More disturbing was his claim that acoustic monitoring had detected what sounded like rhythmic movements below ground, following patterns that suggested purposeful activity rather than natural geological processes. The most recent official document related to the McCoy well case is a short addendum to the closed file dated September 1969. A county maintenance worker reported that while retrieving archived materials, he noticed the mason jar containing the list of names had been disturbed. According to his statement, the paper inside now contained an additional name, his own, written in the same hand as the others. He requested immediate reassignment and refused to return to the archives. The document was marked unsubstantiated and filed without further investigation. The worker, James Harmon, resigned from county employment within a month of the incident. Attempts to contact him for follow-up were unsuccessful, as he had apparently relocated without leaving a forwarding address. County records indicate he remained alive at least through 1987, when he briefly returned to Pike County to settle his deceased mother's estate, but no further information about him exists in public records. During his brief return to Pike County, Harmon was approached by a local historian interested in the McCoy case. According to the historian's notes, Harmon refused to discuss the matter directly, but offered a cryptic warning. Some things write themselves into existence. Some voices speak through borrowed mouths. Stay away from the lists and jars. They're doors, not objects. He departed the next day, leaving his mother's affairs only partially settled. The county archives were relocated to a new facility in 1972, and many of the original documents related to the case were reportedly lost in the transition. What remains are fragments, partial reports, personal accounts, and local stories that have evolved over decades. The mason jar and its list were among the items declared missing during the relocation, though rumors persisted among courthouse staff that it had been deliberately destroyed rather than lost. In 1994, during renovation of the old courthouse basement, workers discovered a sealed metal container hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. Inside was a journal belonging to Sheriff Thomas Hatfield, containing entries from 1916 to 1927. Most pertained to routine law enforcement matters, but scattered throughout were references to the McCoy case. The final such entry, dated November 1927, described a disturbing encounter. Visited the old McCoy place today after reports of trespassers. Found no one, but the ground around the well has sunk further. Standing there, I heard it for the first time myself, a voice calling my name from below. It knew things no one could know. About Sarah, about the choices I made in '98 during the last days of the feud. It spoke with Elijah's voice, then William's, then others I didn't recognize. I've arranged for additional fill to be delivered tomorrow. Some things should remain buried, no matter who calls from below. Sheriff Hatfield died of natural causes 3 weeks after writing this entry. The journal was transferred to the State Historical Society and largely forgotten until 2012, when portions were digitized as part of a broader archival project. Researchers noted inconsistencies between Hatfield's private account and the official investigation he had overseen, particularly his reference to choices made in '98. The same year, the real Elijah McCoy had disappeared. This reference has led some researchers to speculate about Hatfield's potential involvement in or knowledge of the identity theft perpetrated by William Hatfield. The timing coincides with the final resolution of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, suggesting possible connections that were never officially acknowledged. However, no conclusive evidence exists to clarify the sheriff's cryptic statement. Those who research the case today are left with more questions than answers. What really happened at the McCoy property in those winter months of 1915 to 1916? Who was in the well and who was in the house? What became of Robert Gardner? And, perhaps most troubling, if the names in the jar represented victims, what do we make of the names that were listed but never crossed out? Local folklore has incorporated elements of the McCoy well into broader Appalachian traditions. Some accounts describe the well as a thin place, a location where the boundary between worlds has worn thin. Others suggest it connects to the extensive cave systems that run beneath parts of Kentucky, possibly linking to the more famous Mammoth Cave network, though geological evidence does not support this theory. Modern interpretations often attempt to rationalize the events through the lens of environmental factors. The region's history of coal mining and natural gas deposits has led some to suggest that geological emissions might have caused hallucinations or altered mental states in those who spent time near the well. Others point to potential contamination of water sources with heavy metals or other toxins that could induce paranoia and psychological disturbances. In 2005, author Rebecca Lancaster attempted to research the case for a true crime book. Her initial inquiries to Pike County officials were met with unusual resistance. Freedom of information requests were delayed or returned with extensive redactions. Local residents, initially willing to share family stories about the McCoy property, became reluctant to speak on record after Lancaster had spent several weeks in the area. Her publisher eventually canceled the project, citing insufficient verifiable material, though Lancaster's personal blog suggested other factors were involved. Lancaster's final public statement on the matter, posted in 2007 before she apparently abandoned the project entirely, described an unsettling experience. During my last visit to the site, I found a sealed jar placed precisely in the center of the depression, marking the well. Inside was a piece of paper with a single line of text. Some stories tell themselves through new voices. The handwriting matched samples I'd seen in the archived materials, a perfect match to writing from 1916. I'm stepping away from this project for personal reasons I prefer not to discuss publicly. Following this post, Lancaster's blog remained inactive for several months. When she resumed writing, she focused exclusively on unrelated topics and refused to respond to any inquiries regarding the McCoy case. Colleagues reported that she had disposed of all research materials related to the project and seemed unusually anxious when the subject was mentioned. She relocated from Kentucky to Oregon in 2008 and has since avoided any professional work involving Appalachian history. The old road that once led to the McCoy property has long since been reclaimed by forest. Pike County has grown and changed. The coal industry has risen and fallen, and most residents have no knowledge of the events that unfolded there over a century ago. But occasionally, usually after heavy rains, the ground where the well once stood sinks a little further, as if something below is still settling, still making room. Park Ranger Samuel Whitaker, responsible for monitoring the now protected woodland that includes the former McCoy property, files routine reports indicating the depression continues to deepen by approximately half an inch per year. His requests for geological assessment have been consistently deferred due to budget constraints. His personal notes, shared with colleagues but never officially filed, mention that electronic equipment, radios, flashlights, even wristwatches, malfunction with unusual frequency in the vicinity of the depression. In 2017, during an unusually dry summer, Whitaker photographed what appeared to be faint markings visible in the bare soil of the depression. When enhanced, the images revealed a circular pattern of symbols similar to those Dr. Reynolds had documented on the bones recovered in 1916. The photographs were submitted as part of Whitaker's monthly report, but were subsequently removed by administrative staff, who cited policy against including unverified anomalies in official documentation. Whitaker continued his documentation unofficially, maintaining a private journal of observations that he shared with a small circle of trusted colleagues. Of particular note was his discovery in 2018 of what appeared to be glass fragments scattered around the perimeter of the depression, fragments that testing revealed to be consistent with the composition of canning jars from the early 20th century, despite no such jars having been left at the site in recent memory. Most disturbing was Whitaker's account of an experience in April 2019, during routine monitoring following heavy spring rains. Standing near the depression, he reported hearing what sounded like his name called from below, faintly at first, then with increasing clarity. The voice, he claimed, sounded like his father, who had passed away a decade earlier. Most unsettling was the voice's knowledge of private conversations Whitaker had shared only with his father. He described feeling an overwhelming urge to dig into the depression, an impulse he resisted only with considerable effort. Whitaker requested transfer to another area the following week. His replacement, Angela Martinez, has reported no unusual experiences thus far, though she has noted the continued subsidence of the depression and the persistent absence of vegetation within its circumference. Her background in geology has led her to request permission for soil sampling and ground-penetrating radar surveys, though administrative approval remains pending. Some secrets don't remain buried forever. Some merely wait, patient as the earth itself, for the right moment to surface. And in the quiet corners of Kentucky's hills, where old feuds and older mysteries sleep beneath decades of silence, the past never truly dies. It simply finds new keepers. The most recent incident connected to the McCoy well occurred in early 2019, though it received no official acknowledgement. A group of hikers reported hearing what sounded like glass breaking while passing near the property. Upon investigation, they discovered fragments of a mason jar scattered around the depression, marking the well site. No paper or contents were found, but one hiker reported seeing what looked like fresh footprints leading away from the area. Single tracks that began at the edge of the depression and continued for approximately 20 yards before vanishing completely. As Pike County moves further into the 21st century, the events of 1915-1916 fade increasingly into legend rather than history. The last living individuals with even second-hand knowledge of the case have passed away. Archives continue to deteriorate or become misplaced. Digital records, where they exist, contain gaps and inconsistencies that frustrate serious research. Perhaps this is inevitable, or perhaps, as some have suggested, it is by design. What remains constant is the depression in the earth, marking where the McCoy well once descended into darkness. It neither fills nor erodes away completely, maintaining its presence like a scar that refuses to heal. And on certain nights, particularly when the moon is new and the forest especially quiet, local residents still report hearing something from the direction of the old McCoy property. Not quite human, not quite animal. A sound that rises from the earth itself before falling suddenly silent.